book of Genesis that are often kind of taught individually, kind of in isolation, and we're kind of weaving through them the one great big story, the grand narrative that appears there. This morning we're looking at Genesis chapter 12, and Sadie Kennedy is going to bring us our reading.
Genesis 12, 1-9. God told Abraham, "Leave your country, your family, and your father's homeland for the land I will show you. I'll make you a great nation and bless you. I'll make you famous. You'll be a blessing, and I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you." So Abram left just as God said, and Lot left with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Abram took his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot with him, along with all their possessions and people they had gotten in Haran, and set out for the land of Canaan, and arrived safe and sound. Abram passed through the country as far as Shechem and Oak of Moreh. At that, the Canaanites occupied the land. God appeared to Abraham and said, "I will give you this land to your children." Abram built an altar at the place God had appeared to him. He moved on from there to a hill country east of Bethel, and pitched his tent between Bethel to the west of Ai to the east. He built an altar there and prayed to God. Abram kept moving, steadily making his way south to Negev.
Today we're going to be looking at the question of why did God choose Abraham. Now, Western readers like us tend to not ask questions like that. We're not really interested in that sort of thing. If I were to say, why did God choose Abraham, you would probably say, well, I don't know, God did. God chose him. Why would you even ask a question like that? But to Eastern readers, the writers of this book and then the original readers of this book, this is a question that they're actually quite interested in. In fact, that's what's happening at the end of Genesis chapter 11. As we conclude a long genealogy, there's a little bit of narrative that leads into the text that Sadie read for us this morning. Now, I'd invite you, if you've got a Bible handy, to turn to Genesis chapter 11. We're going to start looking at verse 27 and what follows. There in verse 27 we read there's a guy named Terah, and Terah has three sons, Abram, the firstborn, Nahor, and Haran. And we read that something terrible happens in the story. Haran has a son, Lot. And we learn in verse 29 he actually has two daughters as well, but before they're very old. In fact, before Terah, their grandfather is very old, Haran dies untimely. And there are a few subtle clues that are hidden in the text that are important for us to notice this morning. So I'm going to look at verse 29. Abraham and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Haran and Iscah. Now, Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. Now, in the English, those little cues that are in the Hebrew text can be glossed over and almost missed. The Hebrew Midrash, or an ancient commentary on the book of Genesis, notices that in verse 29 it says, Abram and Nahor, he married. Now, grammatically speaking, that doesn't make any sense for us. The number doesn't agree. You've got two people and then use a singular pronoun. If this was an English assignment, you'd probably have this circled in red and handed back to you. But in Hebrew, this was a way of cueing something, of presenting a possibility. In Hebrew, this is a way of saying that one person decided to do something, usually a charitable or a gracious act, and then the other person agreed and kind of went along with them in it. We see an example of this same grammatical feature back in Genesis chapter 9. In a story following the flood, which we didn't talk about except perhaps during the sermon discussion class, we read that Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and then went and told his two brothers. But Shem and Japheth, he took a garment, laid it across their shoulders, walked backwards, and laid it on their naked father so they wouldn't have to look at his naked body. Ugh. So their faces are turned away. They didn't see their father's nakedness. So the same thing's happening here, that Shem and Japheth thought this should happen. Shem suggested it. Japheth went along with it. This covering of their father's nakedness. They're covering their father's shame. So here in Genesis 12, we have Haran dies. And Abram and Nahor, Abram decides to do something charitable and gracious. And Nahor says, yeah, let's do that. And they marry. Now, the text tells us that Abram marries Sarai and that Nahor marries Milcah. Then insert record scratch noise, and oh yeah, she's the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Well, who's this Milcah person that we're talking about? The author seems almost scatterbrained in the way that they tell the story. The story seems all over the map, but a couple of clues are hidden in the text that can be rescued. Iscah just appears out of nowhere, it would seem, and then we quickly go back to Sarah and we are told that she's barren and she has no kids. Well, who's Iscah and why is she important to this story? Well, it would help if you knew that Iscah is a Chaldean name. It's a Chaldean word that means my princess. Sarai is a Hebrew name that means my princess. So what does that mean? Well, according to the Hebrew Midrash, what they're suggesting here is that Sarai and Iscah are the same person. That it's just two different names for the same person. One, a Chaldean name, probably given to her by her father while they lived in Ur. And then Sarai, this new Hebrew name, this new identity that Sarai is going to follow as the story progresses. I know most of you, though, are clever Bible students, that you are clever readers of the Bible, and some of you are probably thinking, well, hang on a second. Didn't I just read in our Bible reading program this week that in Genesis chapter 20, Abraham lies for the second time about Sarah being his wife? We're going to talk about that story next week. Abram in a pinch with Abimelech is found out, and then he says, well, okay, you know what, I'm only slightly lying. She's my sister. She's the daughter of my father, though not through my mother. Well, hang on. Is she his niece or his sister? What's going on here? Abram is using a Hebrew word here that means close relative. It could be read as sister or it could be read as niece. What he says is that Sarai is descended from his father, a descendant of, but is not born to his mother. In fact, she was born to his brother's wife. Well, so what? So even if Sarai, otherwise known as Iscah, is Abram's niece instead of sister or half-sister or whatever the case may be, what's going on here? In verse 30, we have this interesting detail that's added that until I'd read about it this week, I'd never given it a lot of thought. Verse 30 says that Sarai is barren and has no children. The text reads that she is barren, not that she will be discovered to be barren 15 years later, 20 years later, after they've tried and failed to have kids many, many, many times. She is not married, and she's not going to have any kids. That's what the text says. Well, how did they know? It's important to appreciate that in the ancient Near East, and this might be some information that little ones might need to cover their ears. I don't know how far you are along the birds and the bees conversation in your household. But in the ancient Near East, a young woman would have her period. And soon after that, she would be arranged to be married to someone in the tribe or a relative in the clan. There is little or no gynecological wisdom in the ancient Near East. And I don't feel like I'm qualified to give that information. And I actually don't even really want to talk about it this morning. But suffice it to say that Sarai's not already married. And it's already known here at the outset that she's not going to have any kids, that she's not going to extend anybody's family line. So Haran dies, and his 3 kids need to be provided for, and Abram decides, we need to marry these girls off, and Nahor says, yeah, I think we need to do that. So Abram chooses Sarai. from whom he has little hope of ever seeing any offspring. And Nahor marries Milcah, who it turns out has like 8 kids. Abram, for all intents and purposes, adopts Lot as his own son. And so, the ancient writer of Genesis is pausing here in chapter 11 to use a genealogy to tell a story that gives us an insight into the kind of person that Abram is. What kind of a person is he? He's the kind of guy that's compassionate. He's a guy that looks out for family. He's a person that puts other people's needs ahead of his own. We see this same character trait next chapter in Genesis chapter 13. Years and years later, Abram and Lot have become so wealthy that they can't even share land. And so Abram and Lot go to the top of a mountain and they look and they see the land before them. And Abram, who's the patriarch, who's the one that's in charge, the one that has every right to have first choice, says to Lot, Lot, choose the land that you'll go into. You choose where you want to go, and then I'll take what's left. This is the man that God chooses to partner with in Genesis chapter 12. Now, there's one other thing that you need to understand in ancient Near East culture. It is, of course, a deeply patriarchal culture that everyone belongs to their father's household. In the Hebrew, it's this word called bet of. You belong to the bet of your father, and your purpose, whether you're a son or your daughter, is to further the legacy of your father, to serve and to contribute to the clan. If your dad is a carpenter and you're a son, then you're going to learn to be a carpenter. Right at your father's side, you're going to extend your father's business and his capacity to earn. You benefit by your father benefiting. You're going to learn the trade and advance your father's career. And if you're a daughter, then you are going to support the family household. You are going to contribute to the legacy of your father. You're going to earn honor for your father by attracting the most beneficial marriage that you can for your father's household. Family comes first. In Genesis chapter 11, we see that Terah has been on the move. He left Ur of the Chaldeans and he's heading up through the Fertile Crescent into Haran, which is spelt in English the same as his son Haran, but in the Hebrew it's slightly different. The place is Haran with a H instead of the H. Anyway, it's there that Tehran stops, and ultimately it's there that Tehran dies. And that's where Abram is when he receives the call of God in Genesis chapter 12, the text Sadie read for us this morning. God's call is a bold call. It's difficult for us to appreciate in our culture today just how bold it is for Abram, the firstborn, to leave his clan, to leave his father's bet of, his father's household. It meant leaving everything. It meant leaving his support network, the clients that his father had. It meant leaving his father's wealth, his inheritance to his brother. It meant leaving his father's household gods and the culture and all the different practices that were commonplace in Abraham's house growing up. There isn't an easy parallel in Western culture for what this would be like. For us today, we read this story like God is saying, Abram, come on, man, get up, move out of your parents' basement and get a life, for crying out loud. You're 75 years old, man. But this was a significant move. It was a leap of faith, if you will. And that's the second feature of Abram's character that makes him stand out as God's choice for someone to work with. It's what we know him by, Abram's faith. Now, Abram's faith is an active faith. Abram's faith leads him to do amazing things, bold things. Abraham's faith creates a very different story for him and for Sarai. It's Abram's faith that creates this world in which God acts. Now, of course, God is sovereign and God makes the universe, and he didn't need anyone's consent to do that. Nobody had to believe in God for God to create the universe, the stars, the heavens, the earth, the seas, and everything in them. But there's something that happens when we trust a word that's pronounced by God, when our faith leads to action, and then God moves into that story. Here in Genesis chapter 12, God proclaims, go. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless the people that bless you. I'm going to curse the people that curse you. All nations of the world are going to be blessed because of you. And Abram takes God at his word and goes. And God's story becomes Abram's story. God leaves the place that he knows. He leaves the story of the ancient Near East with its patronage and with its passing down of vain legacies. Abram leaves behind the household gods and everything that he knew to trust this one that calls him. And the rest of the story, Abram's story, is God's story. It fills most of the Bible. Jewish people today trust their lineage to this man and his decision to trust God and to go forward. God calls and Abram responds. God says go and Abram goes. And he travels to the land of Canaan. And there he sets up an altar to God. And there's this great phrase in chapter 12, verse 8. It's a distinct phrase. He calls on the name of the Lord. And so what does that mean? This is a phrase that first appeared in Genesis chapter 4, verse 26. It's the very beginning of the human story. It reads, and Seth also had a son born to him, and he called his name Enosh. And at that time, men began to call upon the name of the Lord. This is the beginning of the whole new thing that's happening. Adam and Eve had had a story. They were living with God, living in a garden together with him. And of course, sin enters that story. Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden. And their family, of course, begins to unravel. Cain kills Abel, and Seth is then born after that tragedy. And here comes the next generation, the grandchildren of Adam and Eve. And it's at that point that something different happens. It's hard to know. But humanity has always had this tendency to worship the God of the farm field, the God of the heavens, the God of rain, the God of snow, the God of summer, the God of the seas. These little tiny gods, these little tiny authorities in their lives. But we read here that Enosh is the first person of a legacy of people that call on the name of the Lord when he's worried about the crops. They call on the name of the Lord when they're asking for rain. They have an expectation that it is the Lord, Yahweh, the God of heavens and the earth, that is going to make things happen. That's the story they want to belong to. That's what's happening when Abram builds this altar. Now, we tend to think that everybody in the Bible is kind of in on this story, and that isn't the case for everyone. We tend to think that everyone in the Bible is a true worshiper of the one true God, and that's likely not even close to true. There's a big difference in believing in God and believing God. Cain believed in God. Cain talked to God, but he didn't believe God. He didn't believe the warning he was given. He didn't believe the legacy that God was offering. And he wandered off into the land of wandering. And he left God's story. We know that God's story is a story that comes from belief and then action. God saying something, speaking a word into our life. We believe it and create space in which God can act. We make ourselves part of God's story. Here in Genesis chapter 12, calling on the name of the Lord means Abram devotes himself to the worship of the one true God. He abandons the worship of the household gods that he knew growing up. He devotes himself to the worship of Yahweh. Abram wanders from this place, this great tree in Moreh, both physically and spiritually. But Abram keeps coming back to this center. He keeps coming back to this place to kind of realign himself, reimagine himself as part of this story that is God's story. He returns to this spiritual and physical center again and again in the stories that we're going to talk about over the next 3 weeks. Now, we don't worship idols today, of course. I don't think any of you have got a little idol on your mantelpiece that you bow down to every morning. But we do have things that are ultimate for us. We do have some things in our life that we are not willing to give up, no matter what. No matter how much we may claim to call on the name of the Lord, no matter how much we believe in God, we don't believe God. We don't believe the call that's on our lives. The pandemic has been good for one thing, if nothing else. It has exposed how much you and I depend on our own strength. It has exposed how much we want to distract ourselves with activities and events. It's reminded us of how much we test and we try other things instead of believing in God. Now, there may not be little mantles on our mantelpieces, but the pandemic has definitely given us moments in which to take stock. You can see it in our language. We would say that we all believe in God, a phrase that is meant to identify us as followers of God. But do we hear his call? Are we actively making God's story our story? Are we actively receiving the strength that God provides to get us through the day? Or are we just out for a walk in the wilderness, testing our own strength against the day's events? Jim's encouragement this morning to take part in the daily audio Bible is a great opportunity. The Bible reading plan that some of us are already a part of is another good opportunity. Or just simply the daily habit of being in God's Word. It's so important. It's so important to be in God's Word, to be in the Word on a regular basis, because it gives us a chance. It reminds us of the call that God has placed on our lives. It's a reminder of the places where we don't trust God as much as we would like to. It's an encouragement to return to the center of the story that God is telling about us, the person and the character of Jesus Christ, who perfectly embodies the character and the nature of God. When our faith leads to action, God moves in. And being in the Word is such an important part of that. God does his best work in our lives when we listen and when we obey. And when we hear his call and we respond. God has an answer for your questions when you hear and when you respond to his call.